The fog rolled in thick across the training grounds of Outpost Meridian, swallowing everything beyond 3 meters in a gray-white blanket. Sergeant Cale Rowan stood perfectly still at the edge of the obstacle course, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He didn't call out. He didn't pace. He simply waited. The Vrexian cubs had been gone for 47 minutes. To most species in the Galactic Coalition, the Vrexians were apex predators, 2-meter-tall feline warriors with retractable claws, enhanced reflexes, and a hunting instinct refined over millions of years of evolution. Their adult soldiers were feared across a dozen star systems. But these weren't adults. These were cubs, barely 6 solar cycles old, and this was their first real training exercise in alien terrain. And they were lost. Commander Thrace had offered to send search drones. Captain Yilmaz suggested activating the emergency beacons embedded in each cub's training vest. The Vrexian liaison officer, a scarred veteran named Gorath, had been ready to deploy his entire unit into the fog. Cale had refused them all. "They'll find their way back," he'd said quietly, his dark eyes fixed on the wall of mist. "Just give them time." The other officers exchanged uncertain glances. Humans were known throughout the galaxy for their strange brand of patience, but this seemed excessive. These were predator cubs, young, proud, and easily panicked when their acute senses were compromised. The fog had come suddenly, a weather anomaly that the basis systems hadn't predicted. The cubs had been in the middle of a tracking exercise when visibility dropped to nearly nothing. Any reasonable instructor would have aborted the exercise immediately. But Cale wasn't just any instructor. He'd spent the last 8 months working with this particular group of Vrexian cubs, and he knew something that the anxious officers watching from the command center didn't. Panic was a learned response, and he'd spent months teaching these cubs that they didn't need to panic around him. 53 minutes. Inside the fog, Cub Lyra's ears swiveled frantically, trying to pick up any sound over the frightened whimpering of her clutchmates. There were 5 of them total: Lyra, Kess, Dovar, Rinna, and Little Pax, who at 4 cycles was the youngest in their training group. They'd been following a scent trail, working as a pack like their instructors had taught them. When the world suddenly vanished into white nothing, the older cubs had immediately started snarling and hissing, their instincts screaming at them to fight or flee. Pax had simply frozen, his pupils dilated to full blackness. But Lyra remembered something. She remembered Sergeant Rowan's voice during their first fog simulation, calm and steady. "Your nose works in fog. Your ears work in fog. Your whiskers work in fog. The only thing that doesn't work is your fear." "Stop," Lyra said, her voice surprisingly firm for a cub. "Everyone stop moving. We need to find the way back." Kess snarled, his tail lashing. "We need to stop panicking," Lyra corrected. She sat down deliberately, the way Sergeant Rowan always did when he wanted them to calm down. "What did the human teach us?" 61 minutes. A junior officer approached Cale hesitantly. "Sergeant, perhaps we should—" "They're fine," Cale said. His voice wasn't sharp, just certain. He took a sip from his cooling coffee. "Lyra's with them. She'll figure it out." "With respect, sir, she's just a cub." "How can you be sure?" Cale smiled slightly. "Because I'm not doing anything, and that's making her do everything." The officer blinked, confused. Cale had found that many species struggled with this concept. The idea that sometimes the best teaching happened in the spaces where the teacher said nothing at all. Adult Vrexians were formidable, but they could also be brittle. They'd been taught that strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting fear. These cubs were different. Cale had spent months showing them that it was okay to be uncertain, okay to make mistakes, okay to take their time figuring things out, because he never panicked. They were learning not to panic either. Inside the fog, Lyra had her clutchmates sitting in a circle. "Close your eyes," she instructed. "Sergeant Rowan says human warriors used to navigate by stars they couldn't see. They trusted their other senses." "Humans are insane," Dovar muttered, but he closed his eyes. Lyra did too. With sight removed, everything else sharpened. She could smell the recycled air from the base ventilation system. It came from the west. She could hear the distant hum of the power generators, north and slightly east. And beneath her paws she could feel the slight vibration pattern that Sergeant Rowan had taught them, marked the main training path. "This way," she said, opening her eyes. "Stay together. If anyone gets scared, say so. The sergeant says fear is just information." They moved slowly, Lyra in the lead, following the vibrations and the smell of processed air. Pax stayed close to Rinna, his small paw touching her flank for reassurance. It took them another 20 minutes to traverse what should have been a 5-minute walk, but they moved with increasing confidence. When they emerged from the fog, Sergeant Cale Rowan was exactly where they'd last seen him, sitting on the observation platform with his coffee. He didn't jump up. He didn't rush over. He simply looked at them and nodded once. "Good job," he said quietly. Lyra's tail lifted with pride. Behind her, the other cubs were practically vibrating with relief and excitement. They'd done it. They'd been lost and afraid, and they'd found their way back without rescue, without emergency protocols, without adults swooping in to save them. "Sergeant," Lyra asked, "why didn't you come looking for us?" Cale stood up slowly, walking over to crouch at their level. His eyes were warm. "Because I knew you'd find your way back. You just needed to know it too." Gorath approached, his massive frame tense with barely contained emotion. "Human," he said gruffly. "You took a great risk." "No," Cale replied, reaching out to ruffle the fur on Lyra's head. "I took a calculated patience. There's a difference." As the cubs headed toward the debriefing room, chattering excitedly about their adventure, Gorath watched them with something like wonder. "You teach them to think," he said. "We teach them to fight," Cale smiled. "In my experience, Commander, the best fighters are the ones who can think clearly when everyone else is panicking. These cubs just learned they can do that, and that's worth more than any combat drill." The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the training grounds in patches of clearing gray. Cale looked out at it and thought about all the times humans had been lost in their own history. Lost at sea, lost in space, lost in wars and wildernesses. And every time, the ones who survived were the ones who didn't panic, the ones who waited until they found their way, just like the predator cubs had done today, just like Cub Lyra had taught them. And in that moment, Sergeant Cale Rowan felt that familiar warmth that came from knowing he'd done his job right. Not by solving their problem, but by trusting them to solve it themselves. That was the human way.